The year 2024 witnessed a series of aviation accidents that claimed over 300 lives, making it the deadliest year since 2018. The final week of the year was particularly devastating, with two major air disasters occurring just days apart. This stands in sharp contrast to 2023, which was hailed as the safest year in aviation history, with no major commercial airline accidents reported. In 2024, some of the tragedies were unavoidable misfortunes, but others were incidents that should never have happened, from missile strikes to runway collisions. Let's take a look back at 2024 and re-examine its deadliest aviation disasters.
January 2, 2024. A Japan Airlines Airbus A350 was on final approach to Tokyo Haneda Airport. The flight had been proceeding smoothly, and the aircraft was cleared to land on runway 34R. At the same time, a Japan Coast Guard Dash 8 patrol aircraft was taxiing on the same runway, preparing to carry out a disaster relief mission to transport aid supplies to an earthquake-stricken area. That aircraft had already been delayed by 40 minutes. As the Coast Guard Dash 8 taxied along the taxiway, air traffic control instructed the crew to hold at point C, designated at Tokyo Haneda Airport as a holding position. They were placed as number 1 for departure, meaning they were the first aircraft in line for takeoff. However, this did not constitute clearance to enter the runway. Unfortunately, the Dash 8 crew misunderstood the instruction. Instead of stopping at point C, they continued taxiing forward, crossed the hold line, and entered runway 34R without clearance. At that very moment, Japan Airlines Flight 516 was on final approach to land on the same runway. Inside the control tower, the air traffic controller was occupied managing several aircraft simultaneously, and did not notice that the Dash 8 had crossed the hold point and was now occupying the runway. In the cockpit of Flight 516, the pilots continued the landing sequence as normal, unaware that the Dash 8 was in their blind spot on the runway. Just then, a runway incursion alert appeared on the controller's screen, warning that the runway was occupied by another aircraft. However, the runway incursion alert system was known for frequent false alarms, often triggering even when aircraft were still at a safe distance. As a result, controllers had developed a habit of disregarding these warnings. Aboard Flight 516, the pilots remained unaware and continued the approach as planned. It wasn't until the final seconds of landing that the Dash 8 came into view, illuminated by the A350's landing lights. By the time the crew visually spotted the aircraft, it was too late to abort or go around. At 5:47 p.m. local time, the left engine of the Airbus A350 collided with the tail of the Dash 8, triggering a massive explosion and fire on impact. The Dash 8 was completely destroyed, with only the captain surviving out of the 6 crew members on board. The A350, now trailing flames and thick black smoke, skidded nearly 1 kilometer down the runway before veering off into the grass. Inside the cabin, passengers felt a violent jolt, followed by chaos as smoke rapidly filled the aircraft. Thanks to the quick and disciplined response of the crew, all 367 passengers and 12 crew members were successfully evacuated within 11 minutes. The aircraft was completely destroyed, marking the first total loss of an Airbus A350 since the model entered service in 2015. Investigators later determined that this tragic accident was caused by a combination of factors, including miscommunication, human error, and the failure to detect the Dash 8's runway incursion in time. On December 25, 2024, an Embraer 190 operated by Azerbaijan Airlines took off from Baku en route to Grozny, Russia. The flight number was J2-8243, and there were 62 passengers and 5 crew members on board. About 40 minutes after departure, Flight 8243 entered Russian airspace. As the aircraft approached Grozny, weather conditions began to deteriorate. At the same time, the flight crew reported GPS navigation failure, and the aircraft's ADS-B signal disappeared shortly after, a clear sign of GPS jamming. In recent years, due to electronic warfare activity, GPS interference has become an increasing issue in airspace controlled by Russia. Despite the issues, the pilots continued their approach and received clearance to land at Grozny Airport.
At that moment, fog at the airport had significantly reduced visibility, forcing the flight crew to abort the initial landing attempt. The pilots initiated a second approach, but were once again unable to land successfully. The crew then informed air traffic control that they had decided to return to Baku. However, just as the aircraft began to turn back, disaster struck. Passengers reported hearing a loud explosion, followed by shrapnel tearing through the cabin. The aircraft had been struck by a missile, fired from a Russian Panzer S air defense system, a short-range surface-to-air missile platform designed to intercept aerial threats. The missile detonated near the rear of the aircraft, and high-velocity fragments penetrated the fuselage. At first, the flight crew was unaware of the extent of the damage, initially believing the impact to be a bird strike. They declared an emergency and set the transponder code to 7700, the international distress code used to alert air traffic control and nearby aircraft of a critical situation. The pilots initially planned to divert to Mineralny Vody Airport. After receiving reports of severe weather, the crew decided to divert to Utash Airport in Makhachkala, Dagestan. However, weather conditions in Makhachkala continued to deteriorate, forcing them to reconsider their options. With few viable alternates remaining, they ultimately decided to head for Aktau, Kazakhstan. At 10:02 local time, Flight 8243 entered Kazakh airspace and reappeared on ADS-B tracking systems, flying westward toward Aktau International Airport. By then, the aircraft's unstable flight condition made control increasingly difficult. The pilots attempted an emergency landing, but failed to stabilize the approach and were forced to go around. A second landing attempt also failed. At 10:30 local time during the third attempt, the crew lost contact with air traffic control. Seconds later, the aircraft crashed about 3 kilometers from Aktau International Airport. The right wing struck the ground first, causing the fuselage to roll and break apart. The aircraft exploded on impact, and flames engulfed the forward section of the fuselage.
The rear section of the aircraft remained relatively intact, eventually coming to rest outside the main debris field. Of the 67 people on board Flight 8243, 38 were killed, including 2 pilots and 1 flight attendant. The remaining 29 survived, though most sustained serious injuries. The majority of survivors had been seated in the rear section of the aircraft. The tail was riddled with puncture marks, which closely resembled damage typically caused by surface-to-air missile fragments. Investigations indicated that, at the time, Russian forces were intercepting Ukrainian drone attacks and may have accidentally struck the civilian aircraft. Survivors confirmed that during the flight, high-velocity shrapnel pierced the cabin, injuring multiple passengers and crew members. On July 24, 2024, a Bombardier CRJ-200 regional jet was operating a positioning flight from Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu, Nepal, to Pokhara. There were 19 people on board, including 2 pilots and 16 aviation technicians. Prior to this flight, the aircraft had been parked on the ground for 34 days. That morning, maintenance personnel conducted a return-to-service inspection to prepare the aircraft for operation. The aircraft was cleared to operate the flight after passing the inspection. The latest weather report at the time
indicated visibility of 8 kilometers, a few clouds at 1,000 feet, and scattered clouds at 3,000 feet. At 11:10 a.m., the aircraft taxied to the end of runway 02, made a 180-degree turn, and began accelerating for takeoff. However, just after becoming airborne, the aircraft exhibited unstable movements. It first banked to the right, then suddenly rolled sharply to the left, followed by another roll to the right.
A few seconds later, the aircraft's right wing struck the ground, causing the fuselage to slide forward and collide with a cargo container. It then plunged into a gorge approximately 40 meters deep, located just beyond the airport perimeter.
The impact triggered a massive fire, with thick smoke billowing from the wreckage. Fire crews arrived within 1 minute and immediately began firefighting and rescue operations. Of the 19 people on board, 18 were killed. Only the captain survived. Both flight recorders were sent to Singapore for analysis by the Nepal Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission. A preliminary report released in September 2024 found that the aircraft experienced excessive nose-up pitch during takeoff, with the pitch rate far exceeding normal parameters. Investigators also identified operational deficiencies within the airline, including improper loading and inaccurate performance calculations. It was noted that the recorded takeoff speed differed significantly from the calculated value, raising serious concerns about the airline's safety management practices.
On August 9, 2024, an ATR-72 turboprop aircraft was operating a flight from Cascavel to São Paulo Guarulhos International Airport. The flight number was Voo Pas Linhas Aéreas Flight 2283. There were 58 passengers and 4 crew members on board.
At the time of the incident, a notice to airmen, NOTAM, had been issued, warning of a severe icing hazard between 12,000 and 21,000 feet altitude. Weather reports confirmed the presence of strong wind shear, thunderstorms, and significant icing in the area. Airframe icing can severely compromise flight safety by increasing drag, reducing lift, and interfering with flight control surfaces. In extreme cases, severe icing can lead to a loss of aerodynamic performance, making it impossible for the aircraft to remain under controlled flight.
At 1:18 p.m. local time, Flight 2283 contacted São Paulo Approach Control and was cleared to enter the São José waypoint, maintaining a cruising altitude of 17,000 feet.
But just 2 minutes later, the situation rapidly deteriorated. A stall warning suddenly activated. The aircraft first banked to the left, then rolled sharply to the right. Despite the captain's efforts to recover, the aircraft lost lift and entered an uncontrolled flat spin. In a final, desperate attempt, the crew increased engine thrust, but the aircraft had already entered an irreversible descent. The plane plunged toward the ground at an alarming rate of 24,000 feet per minute. At 1:22 p.m. local time, radar contact was lost. The aircraft ultimately crashed into the courtyard of a residential area in Vimeiro, São Paulo State, approximately 76 kilometers from its destination. All 58 passengers and 4 crew members were killed. Following the accident, Brazil's Center for Investigation and Prevention of Aeronautical Accidents, CENIPA, launched an investigation. Both flight recorders were successfully recovered and sent to a laboratory for analysis. The preliminary report confirmed severe airframe icing on the aircraft's control surfaces. The crew made multiple attempts to activate the de-icing system, but flight data indicated the system failed to operate properly.
On November 25, 2024, a Boeing 737 freighter operated by Dunhao Airlines was conducting a cargo flight when an incident occurred during its approach to Vilnius International Airport. According to the preliminary report, the crew reported an unspecified emergency to air traffic control shortly after beginning their descent. Eyewitnesses stated that the aircraft's engines produced unusual noises, followed by a steep, abnormal descent angle. Minutes later, the cargo aircraft crashed into a residential area several kilometers north of Vilnius International Airport. Local authorities, aided by surveillance footage, confirmed that the aircraft had been in a controlled descent for a short time before rapidly losing altitude. Among the 4 crew members, 1 was killed and 3 were injured. The Lithuanian Civil Aviation Authority, along with Dunhau Airlines safety team, has launched an investigation into the incident. Air traffic control recordings revealed that the crew issued a Mayday call, but were unable to specify the nature of the emergency before communication was lost. Both flight recorders have since been successfully recovered and are expected to provide crucial data to help investigators reconstruct the full sequence of events.
On December 29, 2024, a Boeing 737 passenger jet operated by Korea's Jeju Air crashed at Muon International Airport in South Jeolla Province, South Korea. It was the most severe aviation accident in South Korea in decades. Throughout most of the flight, operations were normal until the aircraft entered its final approach phase. Air traffic control had issued a bird strike advisory, warning the crew of possible bird activity in the area. During approach, the aircraft deviated from the flight path multiple times, but quickly returned to the correct trajectory, possibly in an attempt to avoid bird flocks. The aircraft's airspeed remained stable, and its descent rate was within normal limits. 2 minutes later, the crew declared an emergency due to a bird strike incident and initiated a go-around. Following the go-around, the crew retracted the flaps and landing gear in accordance with standard procedures and requested a landing on the opposite runway, indicating a highly urgent situation and a desire to land as soon as possible.
After completing a 180-degree turn, the crew decided to land on runway 19. They intended to deploy the flaps and landing gear. However, why the flaps and landing gear failed to operate properly, or why they were not deployed at all, remains under investigation.
The aircraft landed without full configuration, resulting in a landing speed significantly higher than normal. It touched down beyond the runway threshold, leaving insufficient distance for deceleration. The nose of the aircraft was raised during landing, which reduced ground friction, making it even more difficult to bring the aircraft to a stop. The right engine's thrust reverser appeared to have been deployed, but it was insufficient to stop the aircraft. Ultimately, the aircraft overran the runway, colliding with the runway end safety embankment and the antenna support structure of the Instrument Landing System, ILS. All 175 passengers and 4 crew members on board were killed. The only survivors were 2 flight attendants who were seated at the rear of the aircraft and survived due to their position. Investigators discovered bird feathers and traces of blood on both engines of the aircraft. Samples were sent to specialized laboratories for DNA analysis. The results confirmed that the birds involved were Baikal teals, a small duck species commonly found in East Asia. Looking back on the aviation tragedies of 2024, though the incidents were deeply tragic, we must remember that aviation safety continues to improve. Commercial air travel remains one of the safest modes of transportation worldwide.